Hello, I'm the TrekLad, arbiter of good Star Trek, and this is my review of the first season episode of Star Trek the original series, The Squire of Gothos. In this episode, while travelling through a barren region of space, the Enterprise encounters Trelane, a mysterious eccentric with a flair for the dramatic and the apparent ability to manipulate matter at will. Fascinated by the crew and humanity's violent past, Trelane traps them on his isolated planet, demonstrating his immense power by using them as unwilling playthings for his own amusement. As Kirk resists their strange captor and fights to free his ship, a disturbing truth begins to emerge. The seemingly omnipotent being holding the Enterprise hostage may be far more dangerous than anyone can imagine. I've never been particularly fond of the Squire of Gothos, and on a rewatch, my opinion hasn't changed. This episode feels bloated and aimless, which is strange considering it was written by Paul Schneider, the same writer who gave us Balance of Terror, one of the most tightly constructed and focused episodes of the series. This is the complete opposite, meandering for most of its runtime, throwing ideas at the wall in the hopes that something might stick. It doesn't really start coming together until the 30-minute mark, and by then, it's just way too late. I don't completely hate this episode though, it's not all bad. It does have its moments, and of course William Campbell's performance as Trelane is a memorable one for the most part. But ultimately this episode plays like a disjointed hodgepodge of Charlie X and the Menagerie. Not great that the show's already rehashing ideas at this early stage, and this wouldn't be the last time we'd see them reused either. If there's one reason to watch this episode, it's William Campbell, who looks like he's having a lot of fun as Trelane. There's an undeniable theatrical energy to his performance, one that's equal parts charming and unsettling. Trelane is in many ways a blueprint for what Star Trek would later refine with Q in The Next Generation. He's an all-powerful being, fascinated by humanity, placing our heroes on trial for his own entertainment. Gene Roddenberry clearly thought this idea was worth coming back to, though I have to say, at the risk of having a hot take, that I'm not a fan of Q. Don't forget to tell me I'm a silly sausage in the comments if you disagree. And since Trelane is essentially Q version 0.5, it should be no surprise that this episode annoys me for all the same reasons. For all his eccentricities, Trelane starts off as an intriguing figure. His obsession with Earth's history, particularly its more violent periods, sets up some potentially interesting ideas. But the problem is the episode doesn't really do anything with them. Trelane initially frames humanity as a savage species, but the episode never follows through on this. His motivations are as scattered as the episode itself, shifting from amused host to vengeful captor without much rhyme or reason. While the episode doesn't do much with its potential, we do have Peter David's novel Q Squared, a great example of Trek's rich literature universe and the sheer creativity the franchise has inspired over the years. If you've not read this, I highly recommend giving it a go. It's honestly a wild, absolutely batshit read, but it's a story that actually improves this episode in retrospect by giving Trelane more depth and answering some of its unresolved questions. There are a few other things that I like, although I am reaching to try and be positive here. While it's almost entirely coincidental, I always enjoy seeing the reappearance of the salt vampire from the man trap, a blink and you'll miss it moment that gives the series its first real bit of continuity. I also liked Lieutenant DeSalle, played by Michael Barrier, a very stereotypical looking 60s sci-fi type who would go on to make a couple more appearances later in the series. He does have a strange moment early on though, where he pulls a phaser out on Trelane, seemingly without any orders to do so. It's a small but very baffling moment, a moment that feels wildly out of character for a so-called disciplined Starfleet officer. Another small win is seeing Uhura actually getting something to do. Sure, it's largely based around lust and them being forced to play that awful harpsichord. More on that in a bit, don't you worry. But considering how often she's sidelined on this show, I'll just take what I can get. This episode is a prime example of the original series at its most padded. I remember as a kid thinking that a lot of these classic episodes felt overly long. And while I've come to appreciate the show's storytelling as an older viewer, The Squire of Gothos is one of the exceptions that still feels like it's spinning its wheels and stalling for time. It takes forever to establish what's actually happening, and once it does, it still struggles to give the story any meaningful justification. Like I said, the basic setup, the crew gets abducted by some sort of godlike being, has been done before and would be done again. But where Charlie X had a clear emotional through line and the Menagerie has some pretty well defined stakes, dialogues, this just meanders from one scene to the next. There's a mystery at the start. Who is this Trelane? Why is he holding the crew? And what does he actually want? But the answers aren't particularly satisfying, and the episode definitely isn't in a hurry to get there. Campbell's performance is undeniably fun at first, and I maintain that it's easily one of the main reasons to give this episode a watch. But once the initial intrigue begins to wear off, Trelane's shtick quickly becomes repetitive and increasingly annoying. Without a strong narrative or any real sense of urgency, we're just left with scene after scene of Trelane indulging himself, dancing, reciting monologues, prancing around in different wigs and costumes, and worst of all, playing that harpsichord. That fucking harpsichord. It's easily my least favourite musical instrument of all time, and honestly, I just wish Kirk had shot that instead of the mirror. And let's talk about that ending. The reveal that Trelane is actually just a child and his parents step in to tell him off and basically just send him to his room feels abrupt and tacked on. It's like the writers realised they had no real way to resolve the plot, so they just threw this together and hoped for the best. Not only does this last minute twist feel like a cop-out, but it also undermines Kirk's role in the story. He doesn't outthink or outmaneuver Trelane, he just gets lucky that Mummy and Daddy stepped in to clean up all the mess. For an episode that already feels meandering, ending it on such a deus ex machina makes it feel all the more frustrating. Writer Paul Schneider originally conceived the Squire of Gothos as an anti-war statement, inspired by watching children play war. It's an interesting idea, one that could have added some real depth to the episode, but in execution, it's almost non-existent. Aside from Trelane's fascination with violence, there's not a lot here that serves as a meaningful critique of war, and by the time the end credits roll, it just feels like another missed opportunity. The Squire of Gothos is at best a curiosity, a glimpse at an idea that Star Trek would refine in later iterations, but not a particularly strong episode in its own right. It's bloated, uneven, and unfocused, with a central character who starts off intriguing, but quickly becomes insufferable. William Campbell's performance is the episode's biggest saving grace, but even he can't salvage the weak pacing and scattershot storytelling, and then there's the ending, which is sudden and deeply unsatisfying. Basically, it's Charlie X meets the menagerie, but with none of the intrigue, depth, or emotional weight of either. While it's interesting as a historical footnote, it's far from essential viewing, and for that reason, I'm giving the Squire of Gothos a 4 out of 10. But what did you think of this episode? Did you love it? Did you hate it? How would you rate it? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more Star Trek reviews, and until next time, live long and prosper.